This transition, from the largest debtor nation on earth to the largest creditor nation in history, is the hidden origin story of American global dominance. And almost nobody knows it happened this way. In 1895, the United States of America owed more to foreign creditors than any country on earth. In 1920, it was owed more than any country in history, 25 years. The same country, the opposite financial position, the largest single shift in national financial power ever recorded, and America did not earn this. It did not outcompete Europe in financial markets. It did not build a superior monetary system. It did not convince the world through better governance or stronger institutions. Europe destroyed itself in 4 years, and America held the receipts. The First World War, 37 million casualties, an estimated $200 billion in direct costs, the financial foundation of 4 empires dissolved in a single generation, was the mechanism. Britain sold a century of accumulated overseas investment to pay for the war. France sold. Germany's American assets were seized. The financial architecture of the world inverted in 37 months. And by the time armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, the country that had been a net debtor 23 years earlier was owed $10 billion by the governments that had just won the war with its weapons, its credit, and eventually its soldiers. In the next few minutes, we are going to trace the full arc, from the Morgan Gold Rescue of 1895 to the Allied purchasing machine of 1914 to 1918, to the Dawes Plan's circular flow that caused the Great Depression, and then show you where this exact pattern is running right now, inside a different union, in a different currency, with consequences that are still compounding. If you like this kind of history, subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making it. Before 1895, the context. Because the America of 1895 is almost unrecognizable from the country that emerged from the First World War. And the gap between those two Americas is the entire story. The United States, in 1895, was the largest industrial economy on earth. It had surpassed Britain in manufacturing output in the early 1890s. Its railway network was the most extensive in the world. Its coal production, its steel production, its agricultural output were all records. An industrial giant. The most productive economy on earth, running on a borrowed credit line. Every major American financial crisis of the 19th century, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, had required European bank stabilization to resolve. British banks, Dutch banks, German banks held the bonds that funded American railways, American cities, and the American federal government itself. The United States ran on European financial infrastructure the way a factory runs on rented equipment. You own the output. Someone else owns the floor. In 1895, that dependency became visible in a single episode, one that no American history textbook teaches with the bluntness it deserves. J.P. Morgan, the New York banker who had spent his career restructuring American railroads and consolidating American industry, a man who was 57 years old and not yet at the peak of his influence, watched the United States Treasury approach the edge of collapse. In January 1895, the Treasury's gold reserve fell toward $50 million, the minimum the department considered necessary to maintain the dollar's convertibility to gold. The reserve was draining fast. Speculators were converting dollars to gold and shipping it to Europe. The Treasury could not stop the flow. The government had no mechanism. No central bank existed. Morgan went to Washington. He walked into the White House and told President Grover Cleveland directly, "If you do not act in the next 48 hours, the gold reserve will be gone. The dollar will collapse. The United States will default on its gold obligations for the first time in its history." Cleveland asked if there was any other way. Morgan told him there was not. Morgan then organized a private syndicate, himself and the Rothschild Bank in London, to supply $65 million in gold to the U.S. Treasury. They charged a fee. Critics in Congress called it extortion. Morgan called it the price of saving the Republic. Both were correct. A private banker, not elected by anyone, using a private bank in London, had just rescued the sovereign credit of the United States government. He had done it in a weekend. He had done it because the government had no other option. This is the America of 1895. The largest industrial economy on earth, dependent on a 57-year-old New York banker in a London banking house to maintain the value of its own currency. The distance between that America and the America of 1920 is the story. Now, the mechanism, and how one war produced a transformation that a century of industry had not. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, every government in Europe miscalculated what followed. Within 6 weeks, the major European powers were at war. Within 6 months, the costs were staggering beyond any pre-war estimate. The British government needed to buy shells, food, uniforms, chemicals, steel, horses, and eventually aircraft from American manufacturers. It had pounds sterling. American suppliers required payment in dollars. To get dollars, Britain had to sell its American assets. The process that followed was the largest single liquidation of accumulated national wealth in history. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain sold approximately £800 million in American securities, railway bonds, government bonds, corporate stocks, everything accumulated over a century of overseas investment. 1/5 of all British overseas investment, sold at whatever price the market would bear, because the alternative was losing the war. France sold. Russia sold. Germany's American assets were seized by the U.S. government when America entered the war in April 1917. Here is the number that makes this concrete. In 1913, British investors held approximately £4 billion in overseas investments. By 1920, they held approximately £3.2 billion. £800 million in American assets, a century of accumulated surplus, liquidated in 4 years, to pay for 4 years of industrial-scale killing. J.P. Morgan and Company, the same bank whose founder had rescued the U.S. Treasury 19 years earlier, was appointed sole purchasing agent for the Allied governments in 1915. Every American purchase made by Britain, France, Russia, and Italy flowed through Morgan's offices at 23 Wall Street. At peak, Morgan was coordinating $3 billion per year in Allied procurement, the largest commercial operation in American history to that point. American factories ran at full capacity. American steel mills, chemical plants, food processors, weapons manufacturers, all producing at wartime maximum. American workers earned record wages. American banks, instead of borrowing from London, were now lending to London. The reversal was total. In 1895, London had rescued New York. By 1917, New York was funding London. The financial axis of the world had rotated. Benjamin Strong, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, a man who had a personal friendship with the governor of the Bank of England that he used to coordinate monetary policy between the two countries in ways no formal agreement required or authorized, oversaw the final step. As the Allies drew down their American investments and ran short of collateral, the United States government itself extended loans, $10 billion to Allied governments by the armistice, backed by legislation, funded by the first mass sale of war bonds to ordinary American citizens since Jay Cook's Civil War innovation 50 years earlier. By November 11, 1918, the United States held $10 billion in Allied war debts. The same European governments that had once held the bonds that funded American railways now owed America more than America had ever owed anyone in its history. The financial architecture of the world had inverted. Completely. In 4 years. Without a single American choosing for this to happen. This is the invisible mechanism of financial power transition. It does not require superior institutions or better ideas. It requires one thing, the existing creditor to exhaust itself. Britain did not lose its financial primacy because America built something better. Britain lost it because Britain spent it. On a war it had to win, at a price it could not afford. The question that hangs over this history, and over the present, is whether the same mechanism is running again, in a different direction, against a different creditor. But first, the consequence nobody teaches, because the way America used its new creditor status is directly connected to the Great Depression, and the connection runs through a plan designed by a man who won a Nobel Peace Prize for it. Charles Dawes, an American banker, later vice president under Calvin Coolidge, who would win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1925 for what he designed, was appointed in 1923 to resolve the German reparations crisis. Germany owed 132 billion gold marks to France and Britain under the Versailles Treaty. It was printing money rather than pay. By November 1923, a loaf of bread in Berlin cost 200 billion marks. The same loaf had cost 1 mark in 1918. The destruction of middle-class savings in 5 years had already begun to produce the political extremism that would eventually consume Europe. The Dawes Plan of 1924 was designed to stabilize this. What it actually created was a circular flow of money that had never existed before and had one fatal structural flaw. Here is how the circle worked. American banks lend money to Germany. Germany uses the loans to pay reparations to France and Britain. France and Britain use the reparation receipts to repay their war debts to the United States. American banks receive their principal back and lend to Germany again. Between 1924 and 1929, $2.5 billion in American loans flowed to Germany. Germany paid approximately $2 billion in reparations. France and Britain repaid approximately $1.8 billion in American war debts. The circle ran. American banks collected interest at every point in the circuit. Everyone believed the system was working. It was working until it wasn't. In October 1929, the American stock market crashed. American banks, facing domestic losses, began calling in their German loans. Simultaneously, all of them. Not because of a German failure, because of an American one. Germany could not refinance. German industrial credit evaporated within months. Unemployment rose from 1.3 million in September 1929 to 6 million by February 1932. The Weimar Republic, built on the assumption of continuous American lending, lost its fiscal foundation. Adolf Hitler received 37% of the vote in July 1932, 30 months after the loan recall began. The Great Depression was not simply a stock market crash. It was a loan recall in a circular system that collapsed the entire circuit simultaneously. The country that had become the world's largest creditor in 1920 had by 1932 used that creditor status to build a financial architecture whose failure produced the political conditions for the Second World War. This is not taught in most American history courses. Now, the counter-argument. And it is real. The Dawes Plan was not a mistake born of greed. It was a solution to a genuine emergency. German hyperinflation in 1923 was already producing political extremism. The circular flow stabilized Germany from 1924 to 1929. 5 years of relative stability. The Weimar Republic's cultural and scientific achievements in those 5 years were real. The plan bought time. The problem was not that it lent. The problem was that the system had no resilience. When one bank called its German loans, rational self-interest required every other bank to do the same. No coordinating mechanism existed to prevent collective action that was individually sensible and collectively catastrophic. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, specifically to prevent this kind of simultaneous credit contraction, failed to prevent it. It tightened credit to protect the gold standard instead. Between 1929 and 1933, the Fed allowed the American money supply to contract by 33%. That contraction destroyed approximately 10,000 banks. Ben Bernanke's Nobel Prize was awarded for proving conclusively that this contraction, not the stock market crash, was the primary cause of the Great Depression's depth and duration. The country that had become the world's largest creditor in 25 years demonstrated something important about financial power. Accumulating it faster than you can build the institutions to manage it is not an advantage. It is a trap. Let me give you a current world example. And it is one that most financial commentators have not connected to the Dawes Plan because they do not know the Dawes Plan. Inside the European Union, Germany runs the largest structural trade surplus of any major economy, approximately 5 to 6% of GDP annually. Those surplus euros cannot all be spent within Germany's domestic economy. They are recycled through the European banking system as loans to southern European economies. Spain borrows, Greece borrows, Italy borrows. They use the borrowed capital partly to buy German exports, which generates more German surplus, which is recycled as more loans. This is the Dawes Plan, running inside the euro, in a different currency, in a different century, with the same architecture. In 2010, the circle broke. German banks and French banks stopped rolling over their southern European loans. Greece's economy contracted by 25% over 8 years. Spanish unemployment reached 27%. The Target 2 settlement system, the mechanism tracking how much Germany is owed by the rest of the Eurozone, showed German claims peaking at 1.2 trillion euros. Germany had become, structurally, the creditor of the European Monetary Union in the same way America became the creditor of the post-war world in 1920. And when the lending stopped, the consequences were immediate, simultaneous, and severe. The economists who designed the euro in 1992 did not reference the Dawes Plan. The economists who built the Dawes Plan in 1924 did not reference the mechanisms of 1895. Every generation discovers the circular flow independently, and every generation discovers independently what happens when it breaks. Now, China. In 1895, America was the world's largest industrial economy, but remained a net debtor because its financial system was underdeveloped, and European capital had funded its growth. In 2024, China is the world's largest industrial economy, the world's largest manufacturer, and holds the world's largest foreign currency reserves, $3.2 trillion. It is also the world's largest bilateral creditor, having lent approximately $1 trillion to developing countries through the Belt and Road Initiative. The parallel is precise. But there is one difference that changes the calculation entirely. America, in 1920, became the dominant creditor without planning to. Britain's liquidation happened because of a war. America was the accidental beneficiary. China, in 2024, is becoming the dominant creditor deliberately, systematically, with specific loan terms, specific collateral requirements, and specific strategic port locations tied to each lending decision. America stumbled into creditor status. China is engineering it. The question the pattern asks, will China manage its creditor status better than America managed the 1920s? America's failure was institutional. It had the money, but not the framework to deploy it without creating circular dependencies that collapsed simultaneously. China has the money. Whether it has built better frameworks, or whether it is building its own version of the Dawes Plan, with different borrower countries and different commodity collateral, is the question that will define the next 30 years of global financial history. Leave your answer in the comments. In 1895, J.P. Morgan used a London banking house to rescue the American Treasury. In 1920, America held $10 billion in European war debts. The financial architecture of the world inverted in a single generation. It has done so before. It may be doing so again. The question is not whether the transition is happening. The question is what kind of creditor the next dominant power will choose to be, and whether it has learned anything from the last one. If you like this kind of history, subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep making it.